Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones' unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. This podcast is being recorded on May 17th, 2024. Sandy and Julia Shettler are a mother-daughter team with Tree Action Seattle, which advocates for Seattle's trees at the neighborhood level and at City Hall. Sandy is a medical social worker with a background in public health. She focuses on the physical and mental health benefits of living near trees and the need to bring these benefits to deforested and underserved urban communities. Julia is an electrical engineer by training and works in climate tech. She is deeply interested in preserving the natural environment as a common sense solution to climate change. Tree Action Seattle is a collective effort which was sparked by the City of Seattle's July 2023 approval of the cutting of a large western red cedar. Nicknamed Luma and identified by the Snoqualmie Tribe as historic and culturally modified, this singular tree illuminated glaring flaws in Seattle's tree code. The community that coalesced around Luma's protection catalyzed a movement focused on transparency, accountability, and sound urban forest policy. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, Sandy and Julia. We're delighted that you could be with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'd like to begin, as we often do, by just finding out a little more about Sandy and Julia. Tell us about how you came to founding your organization and journey. And yeah, let's start there.
I'm actually a medical social worker by training, and I'd always had an interest in trees. And I was aware from when I moved to Seattle in the early 1990s, I had an awareness that trees weren't protected because my first experience was in an apartment building I was living in. This enormous tree that I just thought was part of the architecture of the city came down for a really frivolous reason. And through that process, I learned that there was no law to protect trees. So I kind of hung around with different tree protection advocacy groups, especially one woman named Cass Turnbull, really charismatic tree advocate who started a couple of organizations that we're still affiliated with. I followed her work and did things like donating, but it was only when the removal of trees became really evident in my neighborhood, all around me. And that was around the time of COVID. So I had a bit more time because I wasn't working as much. And so that's when it started to grow. And then we can tell you a little bit later on how that gave birth to our actual organization. But that's how I personally got involved with trees.
Okay.
Yeah, I followed my mom's footsteps, truly. I feel like you've always been aware about trees and the importance of trees. I kind of grew up with that value and understanding. And yeah, I would say around the time that I entered college, which I went to college nearby, which I was really grateful for, is when my mom started becoming very aware of these like tree protection advocacy. And I just really tried to follow suit. I think it's really valuable to just try to do what I can and especially talk to people my age about the importance of trees as well and kind of bring it to be a multi-generational movement.
Yeah.
Can you kind of give us an overview of Seattle and its urban forestry issues?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to know what our urban forest is. And Seattle, as most people know, was covered with these huge old growth trees before settlement, and it was entirely clear cut. So if you look at pictures of the city 100 years ago, there's not a single tree or just things that were replanted. But because of the way it developed, everybody had yards, there was space around homes. People often planted our native trees, and there were some that were left standing, small ones from the cutting. So the forest is a mix of those trees, which are essentially descendants of the really big ancient trees, together with a wide variety of non-native trees that people have brought in. And that's probably typical of a lot of cities, but we have a higher proportion of native trees than most cities probably have because of how recently it was cut.
What are the native trees? Because I know we have listeners that are going to be curious about that.
Yeah, they're like, oh, my favorites. Okay, so the first succession forest would be alders and big leaf maples.
Oh, wow.
Those tend to come first, obviously, and then they're followed by Douglas firs, western red cedars, and Sitka spruce and western hemlock.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's our cast of characters. Oh, and don't let me forget vine maples because they're small, petite, deciduous trees, but they're kind of in both the first and second succession forest.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Really spectacular. They're big. They're huge. You're talking about big trees.
They are, right. And that is actually a problem because when you say, let's try to return to planting native trees as we densify the city, who has space in their yard for a Douglas fir with a 4-foot thick trunk, So that has been a real challenge. There are many challenges, but did I answer your question, Hal?
Yes, you covered the natives, but I feel like I interrupted you a little bit, Sandy. You were kind of giving us that overview of Seattle's urban forest and then moving towards some of the issues that it's facing.
So basically, that sort of replanted forest that grew and got more lush as years went by and people added non-native trees, it got pretty green around the 1980s, 1990s. So even though the city was covered with housing like all cities, it was really a city in a forest. It was very lush. And that was around the time that the first wave of development came through, mostly people moving up from California for less expensive housing, stuff like that. That was when some of these tree groups that I've been working with and I'm allied with still got involved in trying to protect trees. We did not at that time have any tree protection ordinance at all. But recently, basically since the early 2000s, with the tech boom and Seattle becoming very popular, the influx of people combined with really just a lack of planning around the urban forest has caused enormous losses of tree canopy. And it's not because of building housing. I'm really clear about this. It's because of carelessly building housing. Because the stuff that's being built, it's infill housing, right? So there was already something on almost every property that's developed, and the trees are on the periphery. So they're easy to save, but they're not ever saved. And so the densification is a benefit by keeping some of the outlying areas from being developed. We have an urban growth boundary, but we haven't developed thoughtfully, which is why we've lost so much of our urban canopy. We've had 2 canopy studies that can actually be used as a basis for comparison because obviously you need the same methodology for all of them to compare.
Yeah.
And so the canopy was measured different ways through the years, but finally in 2016, they settled on LIDAR at the 8-foot level. So between 2016 and 2021, Seattle lost 255 acres of canopy. I argue that the conclusion that was drawn, which was that we have 28.1% canopy, is inaccurate because I am having trouble finding cities that measure at 8 feet. Most cities measure at 10 or 12 feet. So I can tell you that Seattle's got 28% of bushes and trees. But we can't guarantee that they're actually trees. So that's been a real concern and a warning light to all of us.
Well, you as a social worker know that the 30% comes from the baseline for human health.
Yes.
A lot of people think that that's an arbitrary number, but it's not. It has been proven time and again that in order for the human body to be healthy in an urban environment, you have to have 30% tree canopy cover. A lot of people think that that's just, taken out of the sky, but it's not. And so when you were talking about your 20% or 21%, where would your organization like to see your canopy tree cover go to?
So like many cities, Seattle has a stretch goal of 40% canopy. I would be delighted if we got to 30%, quite frankly, because in our last canopy study, which I believe it understates the losses that we've had, the most that we have is a neighborhood with 34% canopy, but many of our neighborhoods have less than 15% canopy. So we've got a long way to go. I estimate because of the measuring at the 8-foot level that we're probably closer to 22 or 23%. I didn't make that up. I've consulted with a number of forest scientists on that. So we have a long way to go to get to 30, but 30 would be great.
And do you have like pockets where the wealthy live, it's greener, and where the red line districts might have been are less, which like we have here in Philadelphia? It's so classic where you have the green in all the wealthy areas and then devoid of green in the lower income areas.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, a friend of ours works at the White House doing the first national nature assessment. And the way he puts it is there's a straight line correlation across the country between health, wealth, and trees. They all go together. And it's just the same in Seattle as everywhere else. And the policies that we have in place really will not mitigate that. One thing about Seattle's urban canopy is that most of our trees are actually growing in people's yards. 47% grow on private residential property, and another 23% grow in the right-of-way in front of those homes. So when development occurs, about 70% of our entire urban forest is at risk from development. So mitigating that disparity is really hard if the laws about tree protection and tree planting exclude private property. We have very little left to work with to bring ourselves up to that 30%. In fact, it's actually not mathematically possible.
Wow.
Yeah, I know we're kind of bouncing around here with different questions, but the neighborhoods that have the least amount of tree canopy now were actually shown to have lost it the fastest in our last 5-year window of study. So not only did they start at a lower level, but they lost it more quickly. And quite honestly, I see how that can happen because the trees that we've been able to save, we tend to save these charismatic singular trees that grab people's attention because they have names and they're huge and stuff like that. But those trees take a neighborhood to save. It takes people watching out for illegal cutting and reporting it, getting lawyers who can certify that they're maybe partly on someone else's property. It requires getting an arborist report to set the developer on notice that the tree's healthy and shouldn't be damaged. Like all that sort of thing takes wealth and time. And if you're looking at a neighborhood where people are just concerned about getting to work and taking care of their families, they see a tree coming down next door. They don't even know that you can call and find out if that's legal or illegal, So the system is really set up to perpetuate these inequities.
So now that you've kind of painted the picture for us in Seattle, tell us a little bit about the story about Luma. I want our listeners to realize that some of the studies that are coming out right now are talking about how trees do communicate. They are smart, maybe not human smart like we are, but they have intelligence. So with that in mind, Luma has been named, and it would be a Thuya plicata, which is the western red cedar.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Luma, first of all, is a huge tree. I'll just go ahead and use the pronoun she. She's a double trunk cedar. Each trunk is about 44 inches across. So really massive tree, surrounded actually by other cedars, and in a part of Seattle that saw very little development until the 1930s. So there is a chance, maybe not old growth trees being in that neighborhood, but very old trees that predate houses being built. So one of the things that we do, that I've done with various tree groups and other volunteers, is tracking individual projects. I'm constantly on the building department portal, examining projects, talking to neighbors about trees they're worried about, that kind of thing. So just like many other trees, Luma came up, and I thought, all right, I think there's a pretty good chance of saving this tree because Luma was under the old ordinance. So it's important to know that Seattle passed in May of 2023 an ordinance that removed all protection from trees on lots being developed. But thankfully, Luma's project predated the implementation of that law. So there was a chance to save Luma. And like with many other trees I've done before, we rallied a group together to pressure the city to make sure that the tree was saved. You know, we have architects that draw up plans. We have arborists that give us reports on, is this a tree that's viable for retention, all that kind of thing. But what happened with Luma is that we got to a point where we realized that we could not save this tree. And I thought, this just can't be. This tree is absolutely enormous and it's on the edge of a lot. But the reason that they decided Luma could not be saved was that the lot had been divided in a way that made her portion of the lot too small. And they didn't want to redraw the line because they'd already issued the permit. So we had a gathering there, just simple, putting flyers out to the neighborhood. And we got a huge number of people. And at that meeting, we basically were doing it just for ourselves to grieve the impending loss of this tree. But some people who came said, we want to do something about this. Come over and meet us after this gathering that these people are having. And so before I knew it, within 3 days, somebody was living in the tree. And that sparked a huge, enormous gathering of people coming from all over. We had people actually coming from other countries. I'm sure they didn't just come to see Luma, but when they came to Seattle, they wanted to see Luma. We had hundreds of people, actually thousands over the summer coming by. And activists continued to live in the tree to protect it from being removed. It probably still might not have worked, except that during this period of time, the Snoqualmie Tribe, which is one of the sovereign nation tribes that's here in Seattle, identified this tree as having been culturally modified. And that means that it shows some remnant growth patterns that look like the branches were bent to show the way to the water, to show a path, right? There's other types of cultural modification, like stripping bark for weaving and stuff like that. But this one was the way that the branching pattern was. And so that brought another layer of protection from the State Department of Archaeology, because that's a protected artifact. So that's really what saved Luma, was a combination of the Snoqualmie Tribe advocating for the law to be followed, and then separately somebody living in the tree and all the publicity that came with that, which also brought people so much joy. And that's how we started Tree Action Seattle, because there is nothing like the hope that an action like that inspires. You know, children, old people, people from all backgrounds, the joy in their faces to see that we would save this precious gift from another time, a life that's usually just extinguished immediately without thought by a bulldozer and a chainsaw. It was super inspiring. So yeah, thanks for asking about Luma.
I wanted to ask Julia, what role have you played within the context of these actions and the organization?
I try to kind of rally around basically anything my mom asks that she needs help on. I try to be there for her. I mean, I really love trees. And I think that primarily I try to focus on if we need to like create a flyer or if we need to have a gathering or something, that's kind of where I try to support and go in and say, okay, like this is how we're going to lay it out. This is how we're going to advertise to people basically to rally support to try to save a tree. And yeah, I think what's great is ever since we've had all of these gatherings with Luma and trying to rally to save her, we almost have a template for what to do for future trees, except for the tree sitting part. But we know that we can, for example, flyer a neighborhood and try to get 10 to 30 people out and show signs and show support. We know that we can ask people to call into the government and email and ask for the tree to be protected. And I think following those steps and having a guideline has really helped us with that.
I think that's great.
I do want to say that she's a master communicator. And when you look at the kind of information that we were putting out, I'll be honest, most of the people when I first started doing this work were my age. And I'm not old enough for Medicare, but I'm getting there. Anyway, but really, Luma sparked a wide, diverse group of generations of the people that are protecting trees. And Julia's role is our communications and managing all of that, the messaging.
So Luma was saved. I just wonder if you could share any stories about specifically how the city responded. I'm going to sound cynical. Was there some coming out and glad handing? Was there a press conference? Was there grumbling because of the surveying that needed to be done? I mean, how big of a deal could it be to do a survey?
I want to add to that. What kind of PR did you do to support what Hal's asking?
Yeah.
We should definitely talk about the protest we did at City Hall then.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
Go for it.
We were so disappointed in the city's response to the Snoqualmie Tribe. We were kind of hardened to the city's basically ignoring the value of trees. We know that Seattle is a developer town. Some people make a joke. They say Seattle's got a great environment, but not much environmental, because we have all these beautiful trees and we like to think that we're really green and progressive, but we have a really antiquated, anachronistic land use code. So no tree can ever be saved if it would impede on any way in developments. Only trees on the periphery of lots can be saved until this new law was passed, which allows all of them to be removed. But anyways, back to the main point, we were used to being ignored and the city not caring about preserving trees for either health or climate justice. But we were shocked that they would not acknowledge the sovereign nation, which is the Snoqualmie Tribe, that claimed this as part of their heritage and had evidence. And they even had support from the State Department of Archaeology, which verified their claim. And so we just couldn't believe it. And it was just silence from the city basically all summer. So as Julia mentioned, we had a silent protest at City Hall because we were so tired for all these years that people have gone down to City Hall and commented at public meetings in front of the city council, please save our trees. Seattle's cutting down all of its trees. And, we never got very far. And then we got this horrible tree law that was worse than anything we'd had before. So we had a silent protest at City Hall because we're done speaking. We've said all there is to say, and you're still not saving our trees. So we filled up the city council chamber with silent people holding signs. And, it made the news. And I think it made an impression. The thing that really came out of this, which was so heartening to me, is that the campaigns for the new city council happened last fall. So right on the tail of Luma being sat in and then saved. And all of the candidates had this in their talking points because they got the questions at every forum, at every campaign stop. So we did see an immediate impact from our action.
Wow. I'm just taking all this in. And as Eva indicated prior to us going with the interview, Philadelphia has just written itself a very dark chapter in terms of tree preservation.
William Penn would be so horrified, and the Philadelphians out there who cut the trees down should be listening to this.
Yeah.
William Penn would be absolutely horrified that you cut our richest and greenest wealth in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
You cut it down, you annihilated it, and you could care less.
It's really shocking. And then to replace it with plastic grass, which puts microplastics into the environment, what a hideous exchange.
But let's keep moving forward here. Although I'll transition with one more piece of irony, the city's Philadelphia Parks and Recreation Department did come out with a really well done Philly tree plan, but it was a little too much too late. And I'm wondering, what does Seattle have to do to raise tree consciousness? I mean, I could ask this to every big city or communities throughout the nation. Values are upside down in terms of tree preservation and the developer mentality. I remember years ago at a seminar, a very well-spoken, very inspirational speaker from Tennessee, Steve Clark, he's since passed away. He said, you have to make friends with those developers. You have to bring them a sack of hamburgers, talk to the bosses with the hard hats. But this isn't a conversation that hasn't happened before. The developer mentality has to be tempered. But let's bring it back to Seattle. Is there any hope for a tree preservation plan that's going to eradicate what you just mentioned, that thing that went through in 2023?
There definitely is hope. The hope really springs from the community. For a long time, when I was doing this work, I kept thinking the next regulatory action, the next bill would be the thing that finally turned the ship around. We had a number of different little stops along the way. Like we had a bill to make sure that tree service providers, arborist companies were registered, for example. And I thought, oh, good. Now the removals will only be legal, but one thing that's kind of notable about Seattle is that like many rural towns, all of our tree management regulation goes through our city building department, which is staffed by people that have usually worked in the building industry. All of their revenue for their salaries comes from permit fees. So there's really no incentive, and it's not in their DNA to save trees. So one of the things that we're doing now is a survey of the top 50 most populous cities in the United States and where is their tree protection housed. Usually it's in the Department of Transportation because it involves public trees, or the Department of Parks. But Seattle's pretty special in a bad way for managing most of its trees in its construction department. And their whole mandate is to build more. We're happy to have more houses built. It's entirely possible. And I think when you look at it in terms of rays of hope, the fact that there are architects now who are specifically designing around trees. We have one that we're working with who has really trumpeted how inexpensive it is to design around trees. A short section of pin pile foundation instead of trench near a tree, little things that are already in our wheelhouse. We know how to do this. We don't need some special new technology. So I think it's going to come from things like that, where trees become aspirational, especially for people in urban heat islands, because that's the other piece here is we have no answer to the person who says my house is 15 degrees hotter inside than it would be with a tree. And Seattle had a huge heat wave in 2021. We lost somewhere between 160 and 450 people directly due to this heat wave. And it was really clear they all lived in neighborhoods without trees. So our eagerness to turn over our properties for development thoughtlessly is having a very direct impact on people who can't afford air conditioning. So I think it's the aspiration of having trees around your home and the health benefits is really the way forward, along with a stronger regulatory framework.
Yeah. And I would also like to add, I think that for me, one thing that I really try to drive home is we're really trying to make trees kind of cool again. I work in kind of the climate tech space and I work in solar energy. And I feel like right now, like solar energy and climate change, everyone's talking about it. Solar energy is a very cool thing to work in. In my opinion, I love it. And I think that a lot of people find it interesting. And our goal with Tree Action Seattle is to make trees as cool and as important as solar energy is or other solutions are to climate change, because it really is a critical solution to climate change that people just don't talk about as much as the obvious things like clean energy.
Yeah, I think that really nails it. Part of me, I'm not going to try to speak to it, but I just wonder what the European approach is to tree preservation in their big cities. I don't want to stereotype, but I could just see that they have like a 10-step process before any tree will even begin to be considered for removal, and then they probably still reject it.
I can honestly say that when I lived in England, they would always plant extra trees because they knew that certain percentage would be vandalized.
Wow.
We've heard things that some of the big old 4,000-year-old Texas tree that was in the one town was cut down just because of a prank. I mean,
That was a prank, yeah.
That was a prank. And, the UK just had replanted their hedgerows, which is a really big thing over there because they lost so many hedgerows and they wanted to redo them. Also, a lot of riparian work that was done over there. I think that there's a lot more thought even on how to come onto the property and how to leave a property. I know I learned all that when I was studying over there, where you had to have a very limited footprint for construction vehicles on a site. It couldn't be bigger than XYZ for construction equipment. Everything was planned out ahead of time. You couldn't just go on a site haphazardly. You had to turn your plans in. It's called environmental impact assessment, where you have to go in and show how you plan to manage the actual construction vehicles and their footprint. They have to just for a minimum amount.
And this is actually hitting on the problem that Seattle has right now, because the very obvious problem is that the law allows the removal of these trees during the planning process. But even when we had the previous law, which would save some trees, what happens on that construction site is just fatal in almost every case. So I'm always going around looking for houses, new houses or apartments with trees over them that show me that the developer saved a tree. And I would take pictures, and inevitably within a couple of years, that tree would be dead because it had not been cared for. There's tons of driving with heavy vehicles in the inner root zone. And you really need to respect the tree as a living thing going through a rough transition when there's construction, and give it some extra water and mulch and all that stuff. And they just don't do that here. It's not in the psychology at all.
The other thing, too, is that because of Europe being as old as it is, and because they value what they have and the little that they do have, they have a lot more laws. And here, it's a free-for-all. We don't value what we have. And if we do value it, we really cherish it. And then there's people who just don't really care. And that's not okay in Europe. They're light years ahead of us. I would say maybe 20, 30 years ahead of us. Even in technology, when I was over there, it took 20 years for what we had over there to come here.
Wow.
Even though we have a big technology center, stuff we were using wasn't used here until much later.
Well, let's hope we can keep enough of our trees standing for those practices to come here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Julia had mentioned, that phrasing of make trees cool and the branding.
Yeah.
As I recall from some of the emails, am I right that you also lost canopy to emerald ash borer?
Not yet.
Oh, you haven't? Okay.
They found some emerald ash borer in Portland a year or two ago, but it hasn't come here yet. We have one large native ash tree, the Oregon white ash. That's the only large ash tree that we have growing. All the rest are gray woods, and we will lose some, but it's not a big proportion of Seattle's canopy. But there are plenty of other threats. We've lost basically almost all of our birches, and we have bronze birch borer, and
Yeah.
they all have it pretty much, and a lot of them are gone already. So those are our biggest. And the Western red cedar, I don't know if you know about Western red cedar dieback. That's a real problem. We don't know what it's tied to because it's also happening out in forests, but it does seem to not happen to cedars that are really adequately hydrated. So I'm sure it's something related to that.
Well, it sounds familiar. I mean, we don't have Douglas fir growing here. We don't have our white bark birches growing here. And I think the consensus is, hotter, drier summers have not been friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Does Seattle, in terms of its street layout, lend itself to street tree plantings? Can you plant trees on the parkways?
So that's always the answer. Let's just plant more trees in the public right of way in that planting strip, right? But Seattle has so many things going on in their planting strips in the public right of way. There's tons of utilities under the ground. Most of the city has power lines out above the street. We have very few underground power lines.
Gotcha. Right.
And the street trees, they just don't make it. There's a few big ones that we have, and they do make up 23% of our canopy. Some of that is unimproved right away, so not really on the street. But trees that are stuck in that hot place between the sidewalk and the street, they just don't live that long, and they tend not to get that big, with a few exceptions. So It's not an answer. My friend who's on the Urban Forestry Commission did an analysis, and he figured that if we fully planted all of our right-of-way and planted out our parks, so those are two sources of public land,
Right.
so even ball fields, right, we would only get to about 17% total tree canopy across the city. So we need our private property canopy to get anywhere close to 30%.
Interesting. So you're really counting on private property to shoulder the bulk of canopy that is retained and preserved.
Yeah, we are counting on it, but the law is actually set up to strip it off of private. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, are you able to partner with any of your educational institutions, colleges and universities? I'm thinking, University of British Columbia right up the road, and they have so many people that are tackling these problems, not only in Canada, but in the States. Do you have resources that are helpful there?
We mainly have a ton of smart people who are involved in academia, but they're just bringing their gifts to this effort. This is really a grassroots effort. So we don't have any formal partnerships, but one of the people who's really been an inspiration to us is Kathy Wolf, who's a researcher on the intersection between public health and urban trees. And so we rely on a lot of her research, and she actively contributes to events that we have, either speaking or providing research that she's done. And we've really found that in terms of advocating for legislative change, if we drill down and focus on that human health angle, that's really where we get some traction, because that's a place that nobody can
deny.
Yeah, deny. Exactly. So I would say we have those few connections. We have a lot of people in our movement who are academics, but they're not formal ties.
I see.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you have any formal planting with neighbors? In other words, do you encourage neighbors to go out and plant? Do you have a time of year when you encourage neighbors in your community to select trees and you get a truckload of trees and you plant them?
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time on that for two reasons. One is the city has a massive planting program. They give away a lot of free trees, and the Department of Transportation also plants trees. They almost never get watered, so most of them die. And so actually that's one of the ways that I really got involved, is that I became the tree waterer for my entire street. I live near a commercial district. So I even got the guy at the country music bar to fill up the green watering bag, after everyone goes home.
Yeah.
It's where they put their cigarettes, So our biggest effort has gone toward, let's care for the trees we have. We don't have a problem planting trees. Seattle's a wealthy city. People love trees. Everyone's going to show up for a tree planting event, but we're there after all that happens, making sure they get cared for. That's one of the problems with our existing regulatory framework, is that the only obligation when a tree is planted as a replacement for a big tree that was lost, so the developer is required to replace the tree, quote unquote. In terms of survival, the only requirement is that you should save a picture at the 5-year mark in case you're ever asked. That's our enforcement of that law. So clearly nobody cares. Nobody enforces it. It's a voluntary thing. Some people love their trees. So they move into the new houses, take great care of them, but those are pretty few and far between. So I don't mean to diss planting programs.
Now, do you do anything with the schools at all? Do you work with the young people?
Oh, yeah. You've done quite a few school events.
Yeah. I used to work in a school and started a composting program for kids to throw their lunch in the right place so it could be taken away and composted. So I love being in the school environment. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, we went and gave a presentation, an all-day event at a local high school. And that's a place that we have a lot of fun, because Luma brought, as I mentioned, people from all generations. It was really quite remarkable. And a lot of kids. And they carried that back to their schools. And so it's really been great. So we don't have formal partnerships, but we have a lot of informal interaction with people in elementary, middle, and high school.
I was just wondering if you had maybe some kind of community education classes, like the teachers would take them outside and take a look at the newly planted trees, or...
Yeah.
what condition are the trees in? Do they need to be watered? How often do they need to be watered? That kind of thing.
Right. And I've done that with a number of different teachers. What it really comes down to is a teacher who has bandwidth.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime I get a connection with a teacher, I just furnish that connection. And it's exactly like you're saying, Eva. The teacher is really the catalyst to get the kids out there, to get them excited. And I just provide the information and resources. Those are really valuable connections. And I jump on them whenever I can. And we get quite a few.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
In my mind, I'm starting to map out how the agencies cooperate here in Metro Philly. And it was actually the job that brought me here from Chicago to work for Pennsylvania Horticulture Society, which was already working quite well with what was then called Fairmount Park, but also Penn State University Cooperative Extension. So right away, you have this foundation of three agencies all pulling on the same rope. It did set the stage for continuously successful urban outreach, citizen-supported tree planting initiatives, which takes me back to a question I have for both you guys is how do you see it playing out at City Hall? Do you have advocates? Do you have councilmanic districts? Is that how that works?
We do. We have both district and at-large council members. And really what it comes down to is what the community asks for and elevates.
Mm-hmm.
And last fall, because of this combination of having passed this really damaging tree ordinance, which was kind of a shock to most people, once they got through the press releases from the city that made it sound really good and started looking at the details and seeing what was happening, it woke a lot of people up. And then we had the situation with Luma that woke them up a little bit more. And as a result, last fall's campaigns, which couldn't have happened at a better time, the tree issue was brought up a lot. And so that's carried over to this year's legislative work. Nothing has actually come out yet, but we know that a number of council members support it. The difficulty, I want to be diplomatic and also frank, that there is a lot of pressure from the developer lobby. They were extremely involved in writing our new tree ordinance, the one that passed in May.
Wow.
We actually documented, how many was it, 38 meetings that they had?
Oh, it was more than 38. It was like below 100, but it was very high.
Yeah. Meetings that they had with city elected officials and city staff specifically about the tree ordinance because they're required to file lobbying reports. And none of the environmental groups or the Urban Forestry Commission or anyone got those kind of meetings. I think the Urban Forestry Commission got 3 short meetings.
And we should quickly explain the Urban Forestry Commission. That's a city council created commission that was created around 10 years ago to draft a new tree ordinance. But unfortunately, they've been kind of sidelined. Yeah.
How many members on that commission?
I think there's 14, and right now it's seriously understaffed because they're not getting the commissioner, the open spots are not being put forward. There's an effort underway to make sure that commission is as weak as possible.
Yeah.
So it's down at least 5 spots, and it's extremely challenging for those brave commissioners.
Yeah, I think I'm going to end this podcast with a headache, but go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the hope here is that, it really is darkest before the dawn. And
yes,
I was so excited about that tree ordinance before it passed. I kept thinking, finally, my dream. I knew that people love trees that live here. And I thought, this is it. We're getting it finally. And when it actually came out and we saw what was in it, we saw it unfold. It's like watching a train wreck, right? What? Another amendment for 100% hardscape coverage? Like, we just couldn't believe it. Anyway, when it finally rolled out and got voted on and all the press releases were done and we realized we've got this train wreck of a bill, that was where that darkest before the dawn moment came. And I think that was really what was behind what happened with Luma, because we grieved not just the impending loss of this tree, but the loss of hope for all the other trees that we knew would also fall. So the fact that the community rose up and basically said, we are not going to lose our urban forests. We have so many supporters. It's just wonderful. So I know that even if this next effort to, quote, fix some of the things in the tree ordinance doesn't work, long term, we're going to get there because that's what the community wants. So don't get a headache, Hal.
That's really interesting because there's new studies right now that says that if a developer leaves a small portion of the original trees or plant material on the site, it actually helps all the other trees on the site to develop after they've been planted. In other words, younger trees will sense that there's older trees on the property.
Yeah.
And they actually do better. Developers aren't in on that secret yet. They haven't heard about that secret.
No.
It's research that's being done. And I wrote an article about it, gentleman that I had interviewed from Texas, and he was saying that the trees develop much faster. And it doesn't have to be far away, or it could be like a really big development. And then there's trees that are sensed close by that will allow these other trees to take off.
Right.
So I think that's really something that you might want to think about and look up for future work within your city. But also the other thing too is that being here in the East Coast, where we're in an older city, there's not a lot of people who think of that first. And I think that a lot of times it comes after the wave of development happens, but that's something that has to happen eventually, because if it doesn't, then the people in the city are not going to have long lives.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the biggest things that we're pushing for as a fix to the new ordinance is we're asking for a tree inventory and landscape plan up front, because otherwise trees are always an afterthought. You just won't ever have them. You know, it's the last thing. And to your point about trees needing other trees to really thrive, that's why urban heat islands become permanent. Because if you've ever seen someone try to start a tree and grow it in an urban heat island, which we're doing now in Seattle, we have several new urban heat islands. Seattle's fifth in the nation for urban heat islands. You know, It's got the biggest differential between the built environment and the natural environment in the top 5, I should say. And so we've got programs to plant public trees in these urban heat islands, but they're surrounded by pavement. There's no trees nearby, and they just don't thrive. It's really quite pathetic to watch. Even when they get watered, they're just sitting there for years, just a little stick. You guys know what this looks like, you know?
Oh, yeah.
So I think that's super important to keep the existing canopy.
A portion of it.
Yeah.
The other thing that I was going to mention is that when you have these ordinances, a lot of times people look at trees as a dressing, like an accoutrement, right?
Yeah.
Where it's a beautiful lamp, it's a beautiful piece of furniture,
right?
You know, added on. We can't think that way anymore. We have to think that it is part of the whole structure of the building too.
Right.
The other thing here in Philadelphia that we have that we really value, and it recently happened in the last 10 years, is that we actually are taxed for the water runoff that comes off of hard surfaces. And if you have all concrete, a lot of people will break it up and do paving that has openings so that the water can percolate down to keep the community cooler. Those are things that are really important. And I'm wondering if you have anything like that in your building plans too.
It's huge. The Pacific Northwest in general, because of the threat to salmon, we still have salmon in the city, actually. But as you know, the chemical from tires is really toxic to salmon and stormwater runoff. And unfortunately, the riparian buffers that are required are often either ignored or they can get waivers and build into them. So there's been a real issue with some of our streams. One that's called Longfellow Creek has like 90% pre-spawn mortality for these coho salmon because of the runoff. So there's really actually stronger environmental protection around stormwater runoff than there is for tree canopy itself, obviously. But the way that the development community has gotten around those stormwater requirements is by putting in permeable pavement. But few people realize that permeable pavement has a short lifespan where it's permeable, then it fills up with debris and it becomes like regular pavement, but they haven't got that here yet. So they're still using permeable pavement as a solution, quote unquote, to do what trees do naturally. This is a little bit of an aside, but something you said earlier reminded me of it. You talked about mature trees. I would almost call it inoculating or seeding the new urban forests that we want to grow. And a lot of jurisdictions around Seattle have recognized the need to have a little bit of tree space on every lot. Like there's a community around us called Bellevue, and then there's the city of Tacoma. Both of them are passing new ordinances this spring that require trees on every lot. There's different formulas for how that is done, but the recognition is like what you're talking about. We need a matrix, not just trees isolated to parks or a certain place, a matrix to sustain biodiversity, but also there's that public health piece. Humans can't just go to trees in a park or have one on a street. We actually need them right where we live for optimal function.
Yeah, and I hate to see it down the line where somebody says, well, Seattle's in the top 10 for deaths in the nation from heat.
Yeah.
That's the kind of data we need.
That's the kind of data we do need so that people can say, hey, Seattle's lagging behind in their tree cover. Eventually, I think that's going to come because the researchers are trying everything they possibly can to make us greener.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the soundbite. If trees are going to keep us cool, what I started using with this debacle that we're just coming out of is heat kills. I mean, climate change is a lot of things, but it's the heat that's going to kill you.
Right. It's not the cold.
No.
You can always warm up, but you can't cool down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Seattle, they did a heat map that I often refer to when I talk to groups. And it was in 2021, but it was not during that heat wave that I mentioned. It was just a regular hot summer week. They did measurements all over the city, and they found a 13-degree difference between neighborhoods with trees and neighborhoods without, measuring from the street in both cases, not standing under a tree necessarily. So the 13-degree difference is huge, and it's really a life-threatening change if you are in a building that doesn't have AC. And unfortunately, the answer to the problem, we call it a Brobenist answer, a tech answer, is getting everyone air conditioning. So Seattle's just about to hit 50% of all structures having air conditioning of some kind, which historically very few people in the city had. But what that does is it places a huge strain on the power grid. We get most of our power from hydropower, and yet the water flow is less because the snowpack is less. So now we'll have to go and buy coal-fired power from Montana, and I'm hoping that that is a wake-up call for Seattle, because Seattle loves to think of themselves as we're hydroelectric, we're super clean. But when you got that much of a draw on a hot summer day, you're going to have to use coal-fired power.
Yeah. We are already wrapping up our hour here, but I guess I wanted to give you both an opportunity. Maybe Julia, if you're inclined, is there anything that we didn't get to ask you? I mean, we could probably talk another couple hours, but any other talking points you might want to jump on?
Yeah. I think that reflecting back on this conversation, I think what really stands out to me is kind of the message we want to send home is that Seattle's a bit of a cautionary tale. And what we're trying to focus on is planting thoughtfully with trees. That's our big message with Tree Action Seattle is we can increase our tree canopy. We can have trees. And right now we've gotten to this point of low tree canopy because we've had trees be an afterthought. And so we're trying to create a community and create really a movement that says we need to plan with trees and we need to protect our natural environment if we want to survive climate change, honestly.
Yeah. And I would say the same because, one of the primary false narratives that we're always trying to dispel is that you have to get rid of your trees if you want to build housing. And there's such a push for housing, especially in the Pacific Northwest, because it's seen as a destination for climate migrants. And obviously the tech field, people have moved here. It's actually reduced a bit in the last year, but it's still anticipated that our population will grow in the Pacific Northwest, in the Seattle area. And obviously those people need a home. And the idea is that we make room for, in the city, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people. But how do we do that? And so we do have to build new housing, but we don't have to cut down our trees to do that. Because I've seen enough projects that it's just clear you could have both. So we just want to say this is a both and conversation. This is not me keeping trees and you not having a place to live, Yeah. So we can do it all.
Right.
And the value behind the trees too.
Yeah.
All the statistics about value of a home and trees is enormous. Without them, the house is worth much less. So I think your developers need to hear that too.
They can still sell their houses, unfortunately. And in Seattle, basically any single family home in the city can be replaced by 3. And there's now a state law that you can replace it with 4 or 6, depending on where it is in the city. So that's our challenge, is having multifamily housing, because that's what the state and city want to build, having that with trees.
Which can be done. And we've seen it happen, but it's just about mandating.
We have some awesome architects.
I bet you do. Yeah.
And architects love this. They want to design with nature. It's only where it breaks down is that there's just that same old mentality that a regular working developer has. It's not so much that it costs more to design around a tree, it's that it's novel. And so I think it's eventually going to make its way into the development community between the creativity of architects and the stronger legislation that we need. We'll get there.
Well, that is a lovely way to wrap it up. Thank you both. And Sandy, that was a great closing, optimistic comment.
We still have to ask our question.
Well, there's your lead up, so you know what's coming.
I'm going to start with Julia. What is your favorite tree or group of trees that you have in your head or you see when you're walking that you say, I relate to that tree?
Yeah, it's so hard because part of me wants to say Western red cedar, because Luma, the tree that we've been talking about, was a Western red cedar, and really, like, she changed everything for us in terms of where we are now and the community we've grown. But a tree that I connect with the most, I would say big leaf maples. I love looking at big leaf maples, and especially when it's sunny out and you can see the leaves at the top. And I just think it's beautiful.
And their flowers. Have you guys ever seen a big leaf maple flower?
I've not.
Oh, it's like a gold tassel.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll send you a photo. You will love it. Yeah.
And what is yours, Sandy?
Well, it keeps changing, but in the last few months, I've settled on Douglas firs. Why? Because they are ubiquitous and people don't appreciate them. And I feel like sometimes it's like being a mom. You're always there, you're supporting everybody, and nobody appreciates you.
Love that answer. But that doesn't include Julia, because she's the one who wanted you to be on this podcast.
You know, the moms are doing all the snacks, and you know how moms are volunteering at the schools. And the Doug firs are keeping us alive. They do all the work in the Pacific Northwest. They cover the mountainsides. And Doug firs tend not to be very pretty when they're in a forest because they're all competing with each other and there's a lot of dead wood, but they get along. It's like such a lesson in getting along because they grow beautifully together if you look at the growth from a distance. And then there's a few prima donnas, like an occasional Doug fir that has no one around it and is just like perfect from every angle. So I just love them because they seem like people to me.
No, that's great. Well, you both have a deep, deep, deep appreciation of trees, and we really love that.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing what's going on in Seattle. And we hope our listeners enjoy this one too.
We have loved this. Thank you so much for having us.
You're welcome.
Good luck with everything. We hope to meet you in person someday.
You are our first mother-daughter duo.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So nice to meet you guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
The Planet Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromeda Recordings in Hollywood, California.